All right, welcome to our speaker series. I'm Sophia Bogle, president of the Friends of Hannon Library. For tonight's event, we have Ed Battistella and his book, Dangerous Crooked Scoundrels, Insulting the President from Washington to Trump. And I feel like we ought to throw in a few more for Biden while we're at it. Anyway, you can find more information on Ed's website, edwinbattistella.com, which Erica will put in the chat box or Q&A, whatever it is. Anyway, it'll be up. But before we begin this virtual event, it is our tradition to take a moment to acknowledge our connection to this land, its history, and its present. The following is a formal land acknowledgement written by the members of the Native American Studies program here at SOU. Southern Oregon University in Ashland, Oregon is built on the traditional lands of the Takelma. Sorry, I moved my notes. Takelma and Shasta peoples. Today we recognize the many tribes and bands who call the Klamath Basin region their ancestral territory. And we highlight the continued sovereignty of the 9 tribes of Oregon and Northern Californian tribes who have ties to this place. That is our land acknowledgement. The Friends of Hannon Library is a group dedicated to enriching the offerings of the Hannon Library, from expanding the overall scope of the collection to being able to add rare volumes to the Marjorie Bailey Special Shakespeare Collection. And of course, we put on this speaker series to help bring our community together. If you too believe in the awesome power of libraries to make the world a better place, please join us and become a member of Friends of Hannon Library. And on a side note, we're looking to expand our board with perhaps another member or two, and we would welcome your interest. We also have one more speaker series event coming up next month. We are lucky to have Stephanie Raffelock, who has invited a panel of SOU students to discuss the creative surge of midlife women and feminist history. And before I turn this over to our host tonight, I'm going to go over a couple of technical items that will help us all relax and enjoy the evening. Because it's a webinar rather than a normal Zoom, you're not going to be able to see yourself, and you'll be muted during the presentation. The event is being recorded, and we will have a Q&A at the end, which you can access at the bottom of your screen. The chat feature is disabled, and while we, let's see, if you have any questions though, we'll work behind the scenes to answer you. If you have technical difficulties, you can email the link found in the registration email. And now I would like to introduce you to our speaker for the evening, Ed Battistella. Ed is the author of 6 books, including Sorry About That, The Language of Public Apology. He teaches linguistics and writing right here at Southern Oregon University. In addition, Ed contributes a monthly blog to Oxford University Press called Between the Lines with Edwin Battistella. He also moderates the Literary Ashland blog and Twitter feed, and he has served on the board of directors of Oregon Humanities from 2009 to 2015, and is on the editorial board of the Oregon Encyclopedia. It's quite the list. Without further ado, here is our own Ed Battistella.
All right, thanks. Thanks, Sophia, and thanks to the Friends of the Library for having me in this year's series. It's a great series. We had Margaret Perot and Amber Reed. And next month, Stephanie Raffelock, Betty Leduc was here. So I'm really honored. What I want to do is talk a little bit about presidential insults and also how this sort of came about. I was thinking about the way that we do things with words, and I had done a book on public apologies, and around the beginning of 2017, it seemed like the national conversation was shifting from possibility of apologies and civility to more like a kind of insult mode. So I decided to do a look at presidential insults historically, all the way back to Washington. And I had a lot of fun with it. So I'm going to share this PowerPoint that has a lot of the information on it. I'll share it right now, and there we go. Um, Dangerous crooked scoundrels insulting the president from Washington to Trump. Um, just to sort of begin, I want to talk a little bit about what an insult is. I mean, we sort of know it when we see it, but it's not always obvious how to define it. So I define it as an expression that treats someone with scornful abuse or contempt. Um, and when I was in middle school, we had insults like um, his parents had to put a pork chop around his neck to get the dog to play with him, and so on. You probably did that as well. It was part of the middle school verbal sparring. And that idea of verbal sparring goes all the way back to Anglo-Saxon times, probably to pre-Anglo-Saxon times. You find these things called flightings in the in Beowulf and also in Anglo-Saxon or in Norse myth, the Locusenna and so on, where one character does a kind of ritual insult to the others. Loki was good at it. Beowulf was good at it. In the modern time, we have the dozens, part of African American vernacular um, culture. Also, the trash talking in sport. And there's a large tradition of literary insults. So you think of someone like Winston Churchill, who had this to say of Clement Attlee, his rival. He's a modest man who has much to be modest about. Or Oscar Wilde, who said of Henry James that he writes fiction as if it were a painful duty. So there's a long tradition of kind of ritual and literary insults. Insults say something about the person being insulted, treats them with scorn, contempt, but it also says something about the person doing the insulting. And yep, the insults can be little bits of poetry. They can also be difficult to distinguish from straight up criticism. So here's an example I like to use. These are two comments that the same person made about Donald Trump. He has not yet been able to demonstrate the stability nor some of the competence he needs to demonstrate in order to be successful. And a few months later, it's a shame the White House has become an adult daycare center. That was Tennessee Senator Bob Corker, a Republican. The first part was a just straight up critique. A couple of months later, as the relationship deteriorated, it moved into the insult phase. One of the great joys of doing this project for me as a linguist was to be able to look at the history of some interesting words that are used to insult people. Among them, I got a chance to look at the etymology of the word jerk, when the word flip-flopper was first used, the mountebank, a great old insult from H.L. Mencken, flathead, doughface, dotard, puzzlewit, gink, scamp, and my favorite, honeyfuggler, that we'll come back to later on. Honeyfuggler isn't what you'd think. So hang on to that thought. I also spent some time looking at the different themes that were used to insult presidents. And from the beginning of the Republic to just this week, the same sorts of themes come up over and over again. The words change. No one is really compared to Caesar anymore. And I can't recall the last time I heard somebody called an apostate. But the sort of semantic categories of insults are pretty stable over time. Incompetence, looks, despotism, cold-bloodedness comes up quite often, and then being a second-rate leader, sometimes a third-rate leader, and so on. In the back of the book, I have actually a little glossary of all the insults broken down as a sort of thesaurus. So if you find yourself needing to construct an insult, you can jump in there and get some material. Well, the way I organize things, and this will be a good Q&A or commentary thing for everybody to participate with. I broke it down into 6 periods of American history up on the slide there. And as you're sort of participating tonight, think about which of these you think may have been the most insult-ridden. You know, where were the politics of the nation the worst? And if you want to take a second and put in your choice in the Q&A, we can see what the voting is at the end. So I will just pause for a second. Well, let's start at the beginning. I won't go through all 45 presidents because time is of the essence here. But we'll start at the beginning. And this is a painting called Declaration of Independence by John Trumbull. It's one of 4 paintings in the Capitol Rotunda. And you can sort of see it looks very sort of serious and civil and almost like a college classroom. Everybody looking at the John Hancock behind the desk. There's Thomas Jefferson handing the draft of the Declaration of Independence. And you can see John Adams and Roger Livingston and Ben Franklin on the right. You know, it seems very sort of civil and staid. 1776 imagery. Here's a cartoon that appeared in 1798. And this shows Matthew Lyon. He's the South Carolina congressman holding the tongs, threatening Connecticut Congressman Robert Griswold, the guy with his foot up, while the rest of Congress sort of enjoys the show. This was much more like what Congress was like in those early years, and it may still seem to be that way today. Well, things were rough even for George Washington. You think of George Washington as being sort of universally loved. He was elected unanimously by the Electoral College. But his own vice president called him Old Muttonhead, that was John Adams, and said that he could barely write a sentence without a spelling error. Spelling was important in those days. He also was attacked by Thomas Paine, who wrote the sort of revolutionary tract Common Sense. Paine had gone to France, where he ran afoul of Maximilian Robespierre. Paine asserted his American citizenship when Robespierre tried to had him arrested, but the Washington administration refused to confirm that he was an American citizen, and he was held as a British national for about a year until James Monroe managed to get him released. Paine wrote a letter to Washington on his birthday, asking him why he had let him languish in prison. Washington ignored it, and about a year later, Paine wrote a 7,000 or 8,000 word pamphlet attacking Washington. Among other things, he called him a hypocrite and said that the world will be puzzled to decide whether you're an apostate or an imposter. Nice rhyme there. Whether you've abandoned good principles or whether you ever had any. So Washington was attacked as a monarchist, as someone who wanted to, was too close to the British even still. And in particular, Thomas Jefferson, when he resigned from Washington's cabinet, uh, had some of his hired journalists attack Washington, and in particular, attack John Adams, who Jefferson ran against in 1800, in 1786 rather, and also 1800. So James Callender, some of you may have heard of James Callender. He was sort of the Tucker Carlson or Rush Limbaugh of the day in Jefferson's employ. He wrote pamphlet after pamphlet about Adams, called him a hoary-headed incendiary, gross hypocrite, egregious fool, and so on. A South Carolina congressman called Adams his rotundity when he was president. Callender later had a falling out with Jefferson. After Jefferson was elected in 1800, he didn't give Callender a government position. And Callender was the first to reveal the Sally Hemings affair. He later turned up dead, which led to all sorts of speculation. So the early founders, we find these sorts of comments. Jefferson was referred to as a dastardly poltroon. Poltroon is a coward, and dastardly is also cowardly. So it's really, he was a cowardly coward. A brandy-soaked defamer of churches, and a howling atheist. Madison and Monroe were widely seen as being in Jefferson's thrall. Madison was his political pimp, a mere puppet, and a little pygmy. Madison was 5'4", dwarfed by his much more outgoing and younger wife, Dolly Madison. And Monroe was called a fawning parasite, a dull, sleepy, insignificant looking man who hasn't got enough brains to hold his hat on. Jefferson, by the way, was one of the first presidents to be accused of burning the Constitution. He was accused of being a traitor and a tool of the French. And here you see, this is a cartoon that we can talk about in the Q&A if you like, but he's burning the Constitution on the altar to Gallic despotism, and the eagle arrives just in time to hold him at bay. Pretty much every president has been accused of defiling and burning or otherwise desecrating the Constitution. We'll see some more cartoons like this as we go forward. Well, this sort of brings us to the end of the founders part. Next, we get John Quincy Adams, son of the second president, who was referred to as clownish by William Henry Harrison, a general at the time, and as perverse and mulish as his father. Jackson was one of the most attacked presidents. Alexis de Tocqueville said he was a man of violent temper and very moderate talents. He said it in French, so it sounded better, but he was also referred to as a confidence man, the first sort of con man president with his painted woman. And you probably, I mean, if there's one thing people remember about Jackson, it's that his wife at the time had a sort of not quite clear divorce from her first husband, and she was attacked as a bigamist. She actually died before he was inaugurated, and Jackson never quite got over it. A monster, a fireside hyena of character, and an ignorant, weak, superannuated man. I had to look up superannuated. It means sort of put out to pasture, retired. The monster charge, by the way, was due to charges of cannibalism during um, during his military career. Um, I'm sort of skipping around a little bit here in this next. Um, Martin Van Buren um, followed Jackson. He was known as the Red Fox of the Kinderhook, also as Old Kinderhook later on. But one of his great enemies was a congressman named David Crockett, that you probably know better as the King of the Wild Frontier. I was never quite able to track down the source of their enmity, but Crockett wrote co-authored a 200-page biography, critical biography of Van Buren, in which he piled on the insults: sly, secretive, selfish, cold, calculating, distrustful, treacherous little man. And there's a little clip from one of the pages. He's what the English call a dandy. Laces up in corsets such as women in town wear, and if possible, tighter than the best of him. And Crockett was just getting started. John Tyler, the first president to succeed into the office from the vice presidency, Jackson called him an imbecile. And one of his good friends called him a poor, unfortunate, deluded old jackass. That was when the widowed Tyler married a woman 25 years younger than he was. Tyler had the last laugh, though. Between his first and second marriages, he managed to have 15 children. James Buchanan, the president right before Lincoln, who pretty much set the stage for the Civil War. One of the great comments about him was that he was a bloated mass of political putridity. Alliteration is very important in a lot of the early insults. Well, this sort of brings us to Abe Lincoln, who, if I had to guess, I would say he's probably been the target of more invective than any other president. All of the presidents think they've got it rough, but there was actually an entire book put together by a writer named Larry Tagg on ways that Lincoln was verbally attacked from both from the North and the South by members of his own cabinet and more. And here you see another cartoon on the right. The Constitution, free press, commerce, states' rights, and so on, all being set to fire by Lincoln. His own Secretary of War said he was nothing more than a well-meaning baboon and the original gorilla. And people were just getting started. He was accused of being a poor speaker, of selling his speeches for money, and of being nammy-pammy, which was what was used before flip-flopper was in vogue. Ulysses Grant, who followed Andrew Johnson. Grant was thought to be a sort of baby politician who was led by his Republican handlers, and also being not very bright. The senior Republican said that he should have lived in a cave and worn skins, and he didn't have an idea beyond a cigar and a horse. Grant was also known as the great presidential quarreler because he would get into arguments with critics. Here's a couple more cartoons. This is sort of evil-looking Lincoln. I mean, he doesn't have that sort of nobility in the cartoons of the day, but you can sort of see. This reminds me of a little joke, and there's the undertaker with the soldier with the shovel burying his comrades, and Grant over here The baby that won't talk at present, the senior Republican uh, Congress people are his nursemaids. Well, the second part of or the last chunk of the 19th century, there were a lot of sort of bearded Ohioans that I always managed to mix up. Hayes and um, Harrison and McKinley and so on. I'm not going to say too much about them. I want to get right to Teddy Roosevelt at the turn of the century. Teddy Roosevelt, of course, followed McKinley, and you may remember that when he was selected to be the vice president, Mark Hanna, who was McKinley's supporter and handler, said that there's just one heartbeat between that madman and the presidency. Turned out to be prophetic. McKinley was assassinated. Roosevelt became president in 1901, served the remainder of that term and another full term. He was a writer, a cowboy. He started out as a representative in New York, where he was made fun of for his fancy clothes. He was called a Jane Dandy, and our own Oscar Wilde. And apparently this stung the young Roosevelt, because when he went out west, he came back as a cowboy, as a sort of tough guy, the Rough Rider. So by the early 1900s, Henry James was calling him a dangerous and ominous jingo, which was basically a jingoist, a warmonger. Other Republicans called him the greatest faker of all times. He was a newspaper in Michigan called him a drunk, and he actually sued the newspaper because he was out of office at the time and won the lawsuit. And the progressive left called him the bellhop of Wall Street. There's a cartoon where he's really just sort of being a faux progressive. I love little Trusty, his coat is so warm. Well, what happened next is the election of 1908 and 1912. But first, a quick look at what H.L. Mencken had to say about Roosevelt. Mencken is one of my favorite insulters of presidents. He said, he was a quite typical member of the upper bourgeoisie, blatant, crude, overly confidential, devious, tyrannical, vainglorious, sometimes quite childish. He also referred to him as a charlatan and a mountebank. So a mountebank, another one I had to look up, is someone who gets up on a box to give a speech, basically a soapbox speaker. Mencken, by the way, liked Teddy Roosevelt much more than he liked FDR. So we'll get to that in a bit. A little bit more on Teddy Roosevelt. Mark Twain said that he was clearly insane. Another commentator called him a thimble rigger plying his vocation among the rural visitors to the Midway Plaisance. I had to look up thimble rigger as well. It's basically thimble rigging is a version of the old shell game where you put a pea under a thimble and shuffle it around. Here are a couple of comments that were made by Taft, his successor. But first, on the right there's Teddy Roosevelt wiping his feet on the Constitution with his signature big stick. So Taft called him a demagogue and a flatterer, and a freak and a honeyfuggler. A honeyfuggler is this sort of old Midwestern word for a schmoozer, a flatterer. So it's basically someone who fools people by honey. But it sounds dirty. So what happened? Here are a couple more cartoons of Taft. Taft was basically Roosevelt's designated successor. And as you can sort of see in the cartoons, their relationship deteriorated pretty quickly. Roosevelt thought that Taft wasn't quite doing the presidency the way he would do it. So he came out of retirement in 1912, ran for what would have been his second or third term, depending on how you count it, and lost the Republican nomination. This was the first time there were primaries. Teddy Roosevelt won more delegates in the primaries, but the Republican establishment gave the nomination to Taft. And Teddy, of course, ran as a third party candidate on the Progressive Party that became known as the Bull Moose Party later on. And here you have some bits of the insults directed at Taft. Man with the brains of about 3 guinea pig power, a flub dub with the streak of the second rate and the common in him. Other folks called him Mr. Malaprop and the Van Buren of his party. Van Buren just served the one term. And here you have the famous honeyfuggler cartoon. This sort of allowed the battle between the two Republicans allowed Woodrow Wilson to grab the presidency. College professor, college president, governor, and then US president. He was referred to as the devil by other Democrats, our Caesar, a human icicle for his personality, and as a strutting pedagogue. And here you see the sort of a really two-faced cartoon and then a kind of school teachery cartoon. Teddy Roosevelt had a lot to say about Wilson, called him a prime jackass, a less virile me, not sure who's being insulted there, neither a gentleman nor a real man. And at one point, he called Wilson a Byzantine logothete. And on the right side, I've included a little snippet from the Cornell Sun, which pointed out that most of the journalists of the time had to go to the dictionary to find out what a logothete was. And Byzantine logothetes were basically bean counters of Byzantium. So there was one insult that Teddy Roosevelt, or one attack that Teddy Roosevelt didn't choose to deliver to Wilson. His advisors were encouraging him at the time to talk about an affair that Wilson was said to have had with a woman named Helen Peck. And here's what Teddy had to say about that. Find it here. He said that no one would believe that a man that looks like an apothecary's assistant is engaged in a romantic affair. So he managed to insult Wilson to his aides, but didn't use the material publicly. It was the old days. Wilson was followed by a newspaper man, Harding. Harding referred to himself as a man of limited talents from a small town. Others called him a spineless sort of individual. He was known for his sort of affairs. So a newspaperman from California referred to him privately as a he-harlot. The president of Columbia University, a Republican, called him a cheese paring of a man. When he died, E. Cummings wrote this as part of his news report. The only man, woman, or child who wrote a simple declarative sentence with 7 grammatical errors is dead. And Alice Roosevelt Longworth referred to him as just a slob. Harding, by the way, was on a Western train tour when he had what appeared to be a heart attack and died soon after. It was somewhere, I'm pretty sure it wasn't in Oregon. It was probably in Northern California where the heart attack occurred. But his wife was present at the time, and there were rumors later on that Harding had been murdered by his wife. There was even an expose book in the late 1920s that made that claim, but it turned out to be a hoax. He was succeeded by Calvin Coolidge, a runty, aloof little man who quacks, sort of New Englander. Alice Roosevelt Longworth said that he was weaned on a pickle. And the son of Robert La Follette, the great progressive, said he had an expression like that of a man who just found a broken egg in his pocket. The cartoon on the right talks about both Coolidge and John W. Davis as being puppets of their handlers. Herbert Hoover, who has a real connection to Oregon. Winston Churchill called him a son of a bitch. Other Congress people and governors referred to him as a jellyfish, a spineless cactus. Mencken called him a fatter, softer Coolidge. And he also called him the sort of man who, if he had to recite the 23rd Psalm, would make it sound like a search warrant issued under the Volstead Act. That was the Prohibition Act. And here you have the things are coming up dry on Hoover accomplishments. Another very dry issue. When Franklin Roosevelt won the election, Time magazine was in its infancy, and on their cover, they had the caption, President Reject, with Hoover's picture. Franklin Roosevelt, another honeyfuggler, this time with 2 G's. And he was in office a dozen years, plus a little bit. So he was really attacked from all sides as well. As a megalomaniac, prize honeyfuggler of his time. Again, Alice Roosevelt Longworth, 90% Eleanor and 10% mush. The left called him a scab president. The right called him a rainy day plutocrat. Again, canceling the Constitution. More Constitution canceling. So he was particularly, it became a particular theme. A moose jaw and a mama's boy. That was the old right-wing columnist Westbrook Pegler. A chameleon on plaid and a gibbering idiot. That's what Hoover had to say about him. A quack, a traitor to his class, and a Wall Street tool. So both sides. I love the cartoons. I think at some point it would be great to do a little um, exhibit for Constitution Day of um, cartoons of presidents destroying the Constitution. Well, this sort of brings us to the modern era, and some of the presidents that in some of our lifetimes. Harry Truman, he was referred to as a vulgar little Babbitt by Henry Luce, the publisher of Time magazine, right, referring to the Sinclair Lewis novel about sort of small-minded, small-town folks. Eisenhower was called Dopey Dwight by William Loeb, the publisher of the influential Manchester Union leader. Loeb had a penchant for alliteration, so he also referred to Jerry Ford as Jerry the Jerk, and Betty Ford as Babbling Betty, and so on. Not very clever, but it had that alliteration. Eisenhower was also accused by the right of being a communist. The sort of nascent John Birch Society said that he was a communist dupe taking orders from his handler, who was his brother Milton Eisenhower, the president of Columbia University. John F. Kennedy, the Southerners called him Mr. Boston Beans. I guess the sort of idea of being full of gas. And Bertrand Russell referred to him as more wicked than Hitler because of the nuclear test ban treaty and not outlawing nuclear weapons. Lyndon Johnson, one of his own aides, said that he was a real centaur, part man, part horse's ass. And Richard Nixon was known as the white collar McCarthy. That was a familiar theme of the Nixon era, that he was basically a cleaned up McCarthy. And here's a cartoon from Herb Block cartoon from 1974. Listen, are you going to be loyal to me or that expletive deleted Constitution? Doesn't actually show him burning it or tearing it up. Still more recent presidents. Jerry Ford sort of got a pass on a lot of things. He was, mocked for being clumsy. He was made fun of for the idea that he wasn't very bright, which probably isn't true. But one of my favorites is that he was a fine-looking man in a Lake Wobegon sort of way, which really kind of brought him down to earth. Ford was actually one of the presidents who took being insulted fairly well, and later on wrote a book on presidential humor in which he sort of made fun of being made fun of. Jimmy Carter, or Eugene McCarthy, some of you may remember, referred to him as an oratorical mortician. Margaret Thatcher had this to say about Ronald Reagan, that there was nothing between his ears. And this is one of my favorites from Alabama Attorney General, sort of the last Democrat before Doug Jones to win statewide office. Bill Baxley called George H.W. Bush a pinstripe and polo playing, umbrella toting Ivy Leaguer born with a silver spoon so far back in his mouth you couldn't get it out with a crowbar. Right? The old Southern insults. Sort of coming up to the sort of present day, one of the insults that was thrown at Bill Clinton, a nerdy little flower child peacenik demonstrating against his country. That was by a California congressperson. George Bush, a feckless, blood-splattered plutocrat. Um, Obama was referred to as a Kenyan cream puff by um, apparatchiks on the right, and it was picked up by people like Newt Gingrich and so on. And Trump, this one is from Arnold Schwarzenegger, a little wet noodle, like a little fanboy. That was after um, the summit with Putin. And here's um, a Trump cartoon with his team of advisors. So one of the things that I did sort of along the way was try to keep track of the insults that Donald Trump used while he was in office. And the New York Times sort of helped me out with this. They actually kept a running tally. And the day after the day after Trump was suspended from Twitter, they updated their list for the final time. Um, they tried to decide how many insults there were. They said it was somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000, depending on how you count. It's probably a little bit less because some of them were not so much insults as just sort of comments on public institutions and things like that. But as I look through Trump's insults, yeah, I noticed a kind of pattern that it really was this sort of attaching an adjective to someone's name. So there was lion, cheating, crooked, crazy, dumb, sleepy, sloppy, creepy, wacky, little nasty, and then people would be failures. But so there was lion, leaking James Comey, and creepy, crazy Joe Biden, um, crazy Nancy Pelosi, crying Chuck Schumer, little Bob Corker, little Marco Rubio, um, little Mike Bloomberg, and so on. Right? So very much a kind of one-note style of insulting. Need to find a statistician to work with me on some of this. So as I was sort of working through this, I tried to think of, what makes a good insult? What sorts of things do you need to include in order to have a kind of memorable insult? I think, not to be critical of a former president, but I think Trump's insults don't really measure up aesthetically. But some of the folks that I thought were sort of in the top 6 of insulters, there was James Callender, who managed to, sort of take it to both John Adams and Thomas Jefferson before he ended up dead. There is David Crockett, looks a lot different in his Congress garb, who wrote that full book. H.L. Mencken, again, Mencken managed to insult just about every president from Teddy Roosevelt through FDR. Alice Longworth Roosevelt. Hunter S. Thompson is another of my favorites. He had a lot to say, particularly about Richard Nixon. One of the great ones is that Nixon was a swine of a man and a jabbering dupe of a president. So he sort of brings both the person and the performance together. But he also had this to say about Nixon, that he was a foul caricature of himself, a man with no soul, with the integrity of a hyena and the style of a poisoned toad. Also, Maureen Dowd, I think, is one of the great presidential insulters of all time. She referred to Bill and Hillary Clinton as the Tom and Daisy Buchanan of American politics. And Donald Trump was the Kim Kardashian of American politics. So she manages to bring in the technique of using the sort of apt comparison. But the things that I think really make for a standout insult: capturing the moment, the idea of what's the essence of this person that you're able to capture. And when Patricia Schroeder from Colorado referred to Ronald Reagan as the Teflon coated president, that sort of captured his essence. Being memorable, sort of using language creatively, being specific so that there's something really to hang the insult on. If you just say someone's a jerk, that doesn't do much. And embracing the sort of poetry of language. So I'll show you one of my very favorites was from Clarence Darrow referring to Warren Harding, that he was a human smudge. I mean, it just sort of manages to bring Harding down to the status of a little grease spot on a window. And Hunter S. Thompson goes the other way and sort of lays it on with adjectives comparing both aspects of the person. So that's I think where I'm going to end. I did want to point out there's some artwork in Dangerous Crooked Scoundrels, and it's by this wonderful artist named Morgan Pielli, who signs his work More Pie, but he did the cartoons along the way. So I'm going to stop the share now and see what comments, questions, insults you all might have.
That's great. I wish you could have heard me chuckling through most of that.
Okay, yeah, it's hard to do when there's no live audience. You don't know whether people are asleep or...
Yeah, that must have been hard, but you forged ahead. So good job.
Just like teaching.
Really? Yeah, these days it's just like teaching, right? Well, I wanted to say my favorite insult that you said, which I think corresponds to all those qualities you mentioned for being a good insult, was that he wore an expression like that of a man who just found a broken egg in his pocket. And I just was like, yeah, like you can just see that look like, and then it made me wonder, it's like, why would he look like that and what was going on? And I just went off on a whole story. So it was really very fascinating.
One of the great kinds of insults are the ones that are little narratives, little sort of mini narratives, and the listener fills in the details. Right? You really sort of get the. There's one about there's one that was told of John F. Kennedy, that he was like the Irish nephew who comes in and sings a song and then disappears when it's time to wash the dishes.
Oh,
so you get a sort of, it gives you a little story, but it also makes a comment on the person.
You do have a question here from Daniel Ulrich saying, what is the best Joe Biden insult? Do you have any?
Oh, yeah, the Biden insults are sort of, I think Joe Biden is going to sort of get the Gerald Ford treatment for quite a while. That there's a kind of perception of him being that Donald Trump created, of him being sort of sleepy Joe Biden. But I think for now he's sort of he's being painted with that kind of puppet of the far left idea. But that's something that I have a little sidebar on the word socialist, and it's been applied to pretty much every president from Roosevelt on. Eisenhower, Nixon, they were all called socialists at the time.
Yeah.
So I think he can endure that.
I thought it was amazing how every single president has been pictured stomping on the Constitution or whatever, like everyone. It's like, wow. I guess nothing changes.
It's
And
really, I mean, they change the sort of, the words change. We no longer talk about dough faces, which was an old, sort of pre-Civil War Southern sympathizer kind of thing. Now we would talk about traitors. Um, but,
Yeah.
but yeah,
Yeah.
the semantics are pretty much the same. Anybody
Yeah.
have any favorite insults or a favorite insulter that they want to share?
Let's see. We're getting a question. What is the difference in insults between American and British politics? Have you noticed anything?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there are some when Trump became president, there were some insults coming from abroad, so you could sort of see how um, the insults from England and other places uh, were not everyone in England is a Winston Churchill. But one of my favorites that came from a British politician was that Trump was the orange-skinned prince of American self-promotion. So some of the insults get sort of spread out among the whole nation.
Yeah. Todd Davies says, I always like Dorothy Parker's insults. Didn't she say when Herbert Hoover died, how can they tell?
Yeah, I was it was Hoover or Coolidge. I looked for some great Dorothy Parker presidential insults. She tended to direct more of her insults to the Algonquin Round Table or any passerby. She was more of the sort of um, Oscar Wilde type insulter. But yeah, that's sort of the only presidential one that I was able to find from Dorothy Parker. There may be some others.
Maybe she
Um,
thought it was low-hanging fruit and didn't want to bother.
yeah, but I read her biography over the summer by, is it Marion Mead?
Hmm.
Um, and it's got some great lines in it. Um, but so yeah, I'd recommend that to anyone.
We've got another question. Do you, for Gretchen Wolke, do you address parodying presidential personalities on stage in your book, like SNL?
Oh, not so much the sort of Gerald Ford actually did a pretty good job of that in his book. Um, so the parody part was it's a little bit hard to write about a parody that makes it seem as funny as the actual parody. Um, I One of the things that I had to do, I had about 1,000 insults that I looked at, and you had to sort of curate them. So some of them for Lincoln and Obama were out and out racist um, insults, and you don't want to make the book all about that. Some of the insults were repetitive. You you'd see the same thing over and over again, and there's only so many times you could throw in the word idiot. So it was really a kind of how do you pick out what's gonna tell the best story? Um,
Yeah, that's a
and there
good
were a
point.
couple that I couldn't verify. So I couldn't, and I was talking to somebody yesterday about this, that I spent 2 or 3 days in these kind of research rabbit holes trying to see if I could really um, verify a particular insult. And in the end, I couldn't, so I had to just sort of leave it.
We have another question. Says, I noticed that the insults were not really about bodies, even though Taft, for instance, was 350 pounds. It feels like it would be a low blow. Is this because the insulters couldn't count on the public knowing what the president really looked like? Or is this body shaming a new low among the public today in social media? I mean, I agree.
Yeah, I mean, certainly Taft was body shamed. Grover Cleveland was referred to as the stuffed prophet. Um, uh, Madison's height was attacked. Lincoln was called ugly,
Mm.
hatchet faced, and so on. So yeah, there was a sort of, um, I guess, a different sort of body shaming. Um, but I think it's sort of always been there. Let's
It's got to be
see.
easier nowadays when it's all on screen. You can see what people look like, so it's just easier. It's not, yeah, it's not a nice thing, but yeah, certainly
Yeah,
not.
I mean, it's a sometimes I felt bad about having to go through all this material, but
Hey, I was just curious, did you think about any or did you like come across any what do you call them? Compliments? Like did you want to did you feel like countering any of this by going and a really
well,
nice compliment?
there were some backhanded compliments along the way. Like
Uh-huh.
Thomas Jefferson said something about George Washington that, you know, he only appeared to be stupid because he was so thoughtful.
Yeah.
So you get those you get those kinds of things.
Those are actually my favorite. That that makes you think a little bit. I like that. We have another question. Did Ernest Hemingway have any good insults for presidents?
You know, I didn't find any from Hemingway. There must be some. Um, one of the things that I did sort of get in a little rabbit hole about was the distinction between you know, in the early days they used to call presidents asses or jackasses. After World War II, it became another form of it became asshole. So World War II was sort of the rise of the term asshole as an insult. Um,
Hmm.
and I looked through an early Hemingway story and a later Hemingway story. And in the early story, he refers to people as jerks. But by 1960, they're assholes. So
Wow.
you can really sort of track um, the movement of a term into the language through someone's literary career.
It just feels like nowadays the gloves are just off completely and absolutely anything goes, which yeah, not my favorite. I wish we would go back to being a little more subtle about insults.
I
That would
I
be nice.
like the other day I came across the you know, I was looking at the old word placebo,
Oh,
which it's an old church word for a pleaser, a flatterer,
no.
um, and that's where you get the placebo that you know you might get in a drug trial or something. But it occurred to me to sort of um, revisit Clarence Darrow's insult and refer to someone as a human placebo. Um, so I've got that sort of in my pocket, waiting for an opportunity in a committee meeting or something like that.
That's a good one. And the human smudge was another good one. One more question. Oh, actually, a couple more questions. Let's see here. Oh, scrolling would be good. I could scroll. Here we go. Let's start with Diana Maltz. The dandy stuff against Teddy Roosevelt is right after Wilde toured America and lectured on fashion and home decoration. He had been in the news and parodied too. He hadn't yet been outed as gay, but everybody talked about his stockings as womanly. He wore breeches. I just read that Teddy R wore a velvet satin purple suit when he first entered politics before his turn to the West. That sounds amazing. I would love to see a picture of the velvet satin purple suit.
There are probably some cartoons and things, but yeah, he was very much a sort of fashion plate and mocked for it in that the 1880s, I guess, is probably about when those quotes were from.
Yeah. And Todd Davey says, at least we don't have fatal duels anymore as a result of insults. What are the worst outcomes an insulted person or an insulter faces these days?
Oh yeah, well, I mean, I think the worst fate that someone who delivers an insult faces now is when the other person uses it for fundraising, because
Yeah.
which is pretty much, you know, oh, this for they, you know, and we saw that today in the news if you were following the John Boehner Ted
Mm,
Cruz dust up. Uh,
nope.
so yeah, it's much more geared toward practical politics now.
Yeah. Another couple questions. Uh, Daniel Ulrich asks about curses and insulting songs.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there are some. Um, they were a little bit harder to find, but there were some um, certainly about Andrew Jackson um, that I can't recall it offhand, but it was a sort of a adulterer, bully, cuckold kind of song.
Mhm. Now I want to hear that. I don't know. Well, it looks like that's it for the questions. Thank you for.
Yeah, and if anybody does want a refrigerator magnet, just feel free to email me or catch me on Facebook, and I will drop one in the mail to you.
Oh,
It's
that's
got
fun.
the book cover on one side and a series of words that you can use to
That's
chastise
great.
people in your home when they drink all the milk.
You can bring one to me when I'm in the library. That'd be great. All right. Well, I just want to remind everybody that this event has been put on by the Friends of Hannon Library, and that our membership meeting is taking place on the 29th, and you can register for that. That'll be up on our Facebook page too, I'm pretty sure. And thank you all for being here. This was really lovely. And I wish we could all clap now. There you go.
Well, thanks for being here, and enjoy the um, rest of the evening.
Right? Okay. Well, we'll see you all next time at the next event in May or at the meeting. All right. Bye, everybody.